Hi, I'm Eric R. Christoph of Hover and Smile. In this second part of our transmitter series, we'll be looking at the basics of binding and model memory, taking the receiver components of your airplanes, your helicopters, big or small, and learning how to connect that to your transmitters. Binding is the process of linking your transmitter and receiver together. Each transmitter and receiver has its own unique identifier code called a GUID code for Global Unique Identification. It's these codes that allow the receiver and transmitter to talk to only each other and not a different transmitter or not a different aircraft. For example, this stock transmitter that comes with the P-51D Micro Mustang Flyer, I have currently bound to my MCX. I'm not that good with the landings while I'm looking at a camera, but suffice it to say, I was able to bind it just by simply following the instructions on the back of the transmitter. The reason is that the Park Zone Vapor, the Micro Mustang Flyer, the MSR, and the MCX all have very similar receiver units in the front, and given that they only need 4 channels to operate, I'm able to bind it to this one transmitter. But if I wanted to use this on a different model, I have to rebind it every time. So if I had a Mustang or an MSR ready to go, I'd constantly have to rebind it, which is going to be annoying because all the trim settings will be different and I don't want to have to constantly rebind every craft I want to fly. That's where the model memory comes into play. You take a look at an example of an advanced programmable transmitter with more than one model memory slot. You've got a Spectrum DX6i. It has 10 model memory slots. That means I can bind 10 different aircraft to this one transmitter. It could be a helicopter, airplane, mix match, whatever. By taking this transmitter and binding it to my MCX, an MSR, or even a foamy flyer, I don't have to rebind every time. Plus, each model memory has its own unique settings that won't change if I switch from one to the other. So if I've got trim settings set up for an MCX, it won't affect my model setting for the MSR. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover binding to the 2 example transmitters we have, and although binding will be different for Futaba or JR or Spectrum transmitters, the process in general, the idea behind it is the same. We will be creating model memory slots for the DX6i to bind it to an MSR, and we'll bind an open model memory slot on the DX7 to a foamy flyer. So let's set that up now. Here we have a zoom in of our Spectrum DX6i. We're going to create an open model memory slot for our Blade MSR and get it ready for binding. I've turned on my transmitter and you'll see that I'm currently set up on Model 8, which is a blank slot defaulting to an airplane. So I'm going to enter my menu by clicking the thumb wheel here. We're going to model select and make sure that we're on Model 8. There's nothing currently bound here. We didn't enter a name into it or anything like that, so I know that one's good. Selecting this will download that model memory slot into your current working set, and that's what we've got. We'll scroll all the way down to Setup List. Here we'll choose the model type. We want this to be a heli, so we'll click in for heli. Go back to the list. You'll want to generally do that first because that can wipe out other settings if you change between helicopter and aircraft. Our model name, of course, we're going to just scroll down, click, select, scroll through a bunch of numbers and letters, and find MSR. Move over, click OK, scroll back up to list. We'll also want to make sure that our swash type under setup list is 1 servo 90 degree. Okay, it's as easy as that. You can scroll all the way back up and hit main. We now have Model 8 as a memory slot ready to bind the MSR. Here we have a DX7. Let's go ahead and create an open model memory slot to bind our foamy flyer to, which is going to be a 4-channel aircraft. To access the model memory slots in DX7, you hit select and down while turning on your transmitter. You'll notice that it pops up by default to model 15 for me, which is a helicopter, and these are all just blank settings. So if you don't see an open model slot, go ahead and scroll till you find one. We'll go ahead and choose 15. I'll hit select and up to show me a menu. The first thing I'll want to change is my type selection between aircraft and helicopter. So I will scroll down to that, hit select and down, and we'll go ahead and choose acro. We'll hit the clear key to confirm that because that wipes out all your settings. You'll always want to do that first, even before you enter a model name. Select and up again. We will then choose our model name, select and down, and let's just call it FF for Foamy Flyer. Okay, now that we've had that selected, select and up. You can see the other options on the menu. We won't really worry about these in detail right now because we're really just trying to create an open model memory slot. So with that in mind, I'll go back to the model selection. Make sure that I'm on model 15. It's now acro and FF. By hitting select and down again, I am now actually in the transmitter mode. I've got model 15 and FF. Just like the DX6, when we bind this, we want to make sure that we bind to the right model number. So I will shut it off while it's in model 15. Now that you have your model memory slots for your DX6 or DX7 in our examples, now that they're ready, you must put your aircraft in bind mode. Now for your smaller aircrafts that Park Zone makes, or the E-flite Blade MCX or MSRs, your Vapors, your Mustangs, to put it in bind mode, you simply take your aircraft with the transmitter off and plug it in. After you do that, you'll notice that in the back, once it doesn't find a transmitter to talk to, the LED will start flashing. You'll see a very vibrant, in the MSR cases, blue LED flashing. If you can't see that, I'll go ahead and pop the canopy off here, and you'll see the blinking blue LED light on the front of the 5-in-1 control unit. So now this MSR is in bind mode. It's basically asking you to finish your drink, walk up to the bar, and ask for its phone number. Now that you've got your MSR in bind mode, I've got my canopy back online. You can see, hopefully, that there's a little LED flashing in the back there. We want to bind it to our DX6i, which we've already set up just a few minutes ago with an open model memory slot. To enter bind mode, we'll take the trainer switch in the back corner here, we'll flip it on. While we turn our transmitter on, you'll hear it's binding, meaning it's in bind mode. You then take the trainer switch off. You'll see the LED go solid, and that means that the transmitter has been bound to your MSR. So just giving it a little throttle control, you can see they're now bound. Now just remember that once you've bound an aircraft, that if you want to not put it in binding mode again, you must always put your transmitter on first and then plug in your aircraft. Otherwise, you're just going to put this guy right back into bind mode. Now I wanted to give another example of binding for receivers that are larger than those small 5-in-1 control units located on an MSR or an MCX. This is your standard Spektrum AR6110E ParkFlite Microflyer receiver. You'll see receivers like this or similar ones to it in your Blade 400 or your CP Pro 2 or your Blade CX3. To set this into bind mode, I actually need a bind plug, which typically comes with your receiver. Now, for Spektrums, we insert that into the battery channel before supplying power to any of the circuits. So I'll go ahead and insert that. Then I'll supply power to the circuit, and you'll see that we now have a rapid blinking light here. Hopefully you can see that well enough. You can see this blinking, and that means with the beep, he's entered bind mode. So now, by taking my Spektrum transmitter, pushing that button in the very back while turning it on, then letting go of the bind button, give it a few seconds and they'll negotiate. The blinking goes off and the light goes steady. Now if I move my right cyclic, you can see I'm having control of the servos with my transmitter. I'll then remove the bind plug, take power off the circuit, and now consider myself bound. Besides binding the same transmitter to multiple receivers, I can also bind the same receiver to different memory slots in a transmitter. Why would I want to do this? Well, consider the case of these Foamy Flyers. I don't have a lot of receivers spare, so I may switch the receiver from this craft to this craft on occasion. If I do that, I can use 2 different memory slots to hold all my settings. And if I just simply pop the receiver out from one to the other, I just choose the other memory slot and rebind. So keep those bind plugs handy, because you'll need to rebind if you switch from one to the other. However, it still beats carrying around 2 transmitters. Just remember that when you're binding, the aircraft is turned on first with a bind plug turned in, or with one of the smaller units, just your battery. Then the transmitter is put into binding mode, the 2 communicate, bind, then you can remove your bind plug, or with smaller units, you don't have to remove anything, and go ahead and fly. But when you're not binding, the transmitter is always the first thing to turn on, and regardless of whether you're binding, it's always the last thing to turn off. I'm Eric R. Christoph of Hover and Smile. Thanks for joining us on part 2 of our transmitter series, Binding and Model Memory.